And then, one night, the line was crossed. She never saw it coming, not because she was naive, not because she was careless,
but because she had been made to believe over months of careful, deliberate conditioning that these men were safe, that this house was safe, that she was protected. She was not.
So Melinda lived with her uncles, two uncles. Now, she lived with them, or she started living with them from age 18 to age 20. That's for complete 2 years she was with them. Every day in these 2 years, these uncles sleeps with her. Like they sleep with her every day in these 2 years. So we're going to unravel this story, unravel this case together, right? Let's dive right in.
She was 18 years old. She had one bag, 2 pairs of shoes, and a future she was absolutely certain about. She was going to go to college. She was going to build something for herself. She was going to finally be okay. She moved in with family. She thought she was safe. For 2 years, inside that house, the house that was supposed to protect her, her 2 uncles, Daryl and Aaron, abused her, repeatedly, day and night, behind closed doors, in rooms where she cried without making a sound, because she had already learned that making a sound made things worse. And no one knew. Not her cousins who lived down the road, not the neighbors who waved hello every Sunday morning, not the people at church who shook Daryl's hand and told Aaron he was such a good man. Nobody knew. And that is what makes this story so hard to sit with. But this didn't start the way you think it did. Let me be very clear about what happened inside that house before we go any further, because Melinda deserves to not have her story buried under careful language and soft words. For 2 years, Daryl and Aaron abused her, repeatedly, inside that house, day and night. No one knew, no one suspected, and she had nowhere to go, nowhere to run, no one to call, no safe person to whisper the truth to without fearing what would happen next. 2 whole years of her life. She was 18 when it started. She was 20 years old when it finally stopped. And in between those 2 numbers is a story that will change the way you look at the word family forever. But this didn't start with violence. It started with trust. It started with kindness. It started with a phone call where a man who shared her blood said, "Come stay with us. We've got room. You'll be fine here." She believed him. That was her first mistake, and it wasn't even her fault.
Before we dive deeper, right, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Stories like this deserve to be told. They deserve to be heard, right? And I really want to know how far this particular case travels. So let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Let's dive right into it.
It was a Tuesday afternoon in early spring when everything unraveled. Melinda was sitting at the kitchen table. She hadn't slept properly in 3 days. She had stopped eating much by that point, not because there wasn't food in the house, but because her body had gone quiet in a way she could not explain, like something deep inside her had just shut itself down to survive. A woman from her church, Sister Patricia, a round-faced woman with gray-streaked locks and a voice like warm coffee, had come by to drop off a casserole, something simple, something kind, and when she walked into that kitchen and looked at Melinda, she stopped. She set the dish on the counter. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at this girl, the way only a woman who has lived enough life can look at another woman who is carrying something unbearable. She said, "Baby, what's wrong?" Melinda opened her mouth to say nothing, to say she was tired, to say she was fine, and instead she broke, right there at that kitchen table, with the afternoon light coming through the window and a casserole sitting on the counter going cold. Melinda told Sister Patricia everything. Not all of it, not right then, but enough. Enough for Sister Patricia to put her hand over Melinda's hand and say, "You are not staying in this house another night." By the time Daryl came home that evening, Melinda was already gone. He denied everything. When the church elders sat him down, he looked them dead in the eye and said Melinda was troubled, that she had always been troubled, that she was looking for attention. His voice was steady. His hands were folded in his lap. He was calm in the way that only guilty people who have practiced being calm can be calm. Aaron did the opposite. Aaron panicked. He called Melinda's phone 17 times in 2 hours. He sent messages that started as pleading and ended as threats. He told her she was going to destroy everything. He told her she was going to ruin the family. He told her no one would believe a word she said. Family members chose sides overnight. People who had known Melinda since she was a child, people who had watched her grow up, decided that Daryl and Aaron were more believable than she was, because they were men, because they were older, because they had reputations, because the truth was so ugly that it was easier for people to decide the truth was a lie. But the warning signs had been there from the beginning. You just had to know what you were looking at. So let's go back. Let's go all the way back to before any of this happened, to the moment Melinda first picked up that phone call, to the moment she made the decision that she thought was going to save her life. Melinda grew up in a small city in the American South. She was the second of 3 children, raised mostly by her mother, Diane, who worked double shifts at a nursing home and came home smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion. Her father had been in and out of the picture for most of her childhood, mostly out. He was a man who made promises with great confidence and kept them with great inconsistency. By the time Melinda was 15, she had stopped expecting him to show up and started building a version of herself that didn't need him to. She was a good student, not the kind who made it look easy, the kind who stayed up late, who rewrote her notes by hand, who asked her teachers questions after class because she genuinely wanted to understand. She wanted to be a nurse. She had wanted it since she was 9 years old and sat with her grandmother in the hospital and watched the nurses move through those corridors like quiet angels, purposeful, needed, capable. She wanted that. She worked for it. By her senior year of high school, she had been accepted to a state university 2 hours from home. It wasn't a full scholarship. It was enough to cover her tuition, but not her room and board. And Diane, God love Diane, simply did not have that kind of money to spare. They sat at the kitchen table together one evening going through numbers that refused to add up no matter how many times they added them. The dream felt like it was slipping before it had even started. That's when Daryl called. Daryl was her mother's older brother. He was 52 years old at the time, a broad-shouldered man with a slow smile and a reputation in the family for being dependable. He owned a 2-story house in a quiet suburb about 45 minutes from the university. He had a steady job in logistics. He went to church every Sunday morning. He coached youth football on Saturday mornings. People liked Daryl. People trusted Daryl the way you trust someone who has never given you a reason not to. He told Diane that Melinda could come stay with him and his younger brother Aaron, who also lived in the house. He said she could stay for free. He said she could save her scholarship money, focus on her classes, and not have to worry about rent or groceries. He said it was the least he could do for family. He said the words family and safe and opportunity in the same sentence, and Diane cried quiet tears of relief at that kitchen table because she had been so afraid her daughter's dream was going to die before it got a chance to breathe. Aaron was 44. He was quieter than Daryl, thinner. He worked in IT, spent most of his evenings behind a screen, and had a habit of appearing in doorways without you hearing him coming. People described him as reserved, polite, harmless. He had never married, he didn't have children, and he and Daryl had lived together for years, and nobody in the family found that strange because neither of them had ever given anyone a reason to find anything about them strange.
Melinda moved in on a Saturday in late August. The trees were still full and green. The air smelled of cut grass and someone's barbecue 2 streets over. Daryl helped her carry her bags up the stairs. Aaron had put fresh towels in her bathroom. They made her a plate that first evening. They laughed. They asked about her classes. They told her she was welcome. They made her feel, for a few brief hours, like this was going to be okay. Think about that for a moment. She was 18 years old, carrying all the hope she had ever built, walking into what she believed was safety. Have you ever trusted someone completely? Someone who was supposed to love you, only to find out that trust was the very thing they were counting on? Tell us in the comments. This story is bigger than just Melinda. She started her classes the following Monday. She was happy, or something close enough to happy that it was hard to tell the difference. She called her mother every other day. She studied at the kitchen table in the evenings. She was building the life she had always promised herself she would build. And behind all of it, Daryl and Aaron were watching, measuring, calculating, testing the weight of her trust to see how much it could hold before it broke. It didn't start overnight. That is the most important thing to understand about what happened to Melinda, and arguably the most disturbing. It started slowly. It started with kindness. It started with gestures that in isolation looked like nothing more than a family taking care of one of its own. Daryl started by making her feel special. He would come home with small things, a candle she had mentioned once in passing, a snack she had said she liked. He would knock on her bedroom door in the evenings to ask how her day had been. He was attentive in a way that felt warm at first, fatherly almost. She had grown up without a consistent father figure, and Daryl seemed to slot himself into that space with ease. He knew exactly what that space looked like, and he filled it with careful, practiced precision. He started telling her she was mature for her age. He said she was different from other girls her age. He said she had a wisdom about her that most people twice her age didn't have. He said these things quietly, like observations, like compliments with no strings attached. She felt seen. She felt understood. She felt, for the first time in a long time, like someone actually saw her. That is what grooming looks like from the inside. It doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like love. It looks like the thing you have always needed finally arriving, and that is exactly why it works. Over the next 2 months, things shifted in ways that were subtle enough to dismiss one by one, but devastating when you look at them together. Daryl started commenting on who she was spending time with. He would say things like, "That girl from your class doesn't seem like a good influence." He would say, "You should be careful about who you let close." He positioned himself as the one who understood her best, and he positioned everyone else as a potential threat. Slowly, her world got smaller. Her circle of friends thinned. She started spending more evenings in that house and fewer out in the world, and she didn't fully understand why, because each individual reason he gave her made sense in the moment. Aaron operated differently. He was quieter about it. He would find her alone, in the kitchen late at night, in the hallway in the morning before anyone else was awake, and he would stand very close and say very little. He had a way of making silence feel like pressure. He would look at her for a moment too long and then look away, as if he was deciding something. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself she was being oversensitive. She told herself that's just how Aaron was. She stopped calling her mother as often, not because she didn't want to, but because the calls were starting to feel complicated, because she would have to explain things she couldn't quite explain, because every time she heard Diane's voice, she felt a pull toward home, and she was trying so hard to convince herself that she was home. By October, she had lost most of her friendships without realizing how it happened. She didn't go out anymore. She didn't have anyone on campus who really knew her. She studied. She came back to the house. She ate dinner with Daryl and Aaron. She went to bed. That was her life. And they had built it that way, piece by piece, day by day, until she was completely, utterly alone with 2 men who had been planning this for longer than she knew. And then, one night, the line was crossed. She never saw it coming, not because she was naive, not because she was careless, but because she had been made to believe over months of careful, deliberate conditioning that these men were safe, that this house was safe, that she was protected. She was not. You already know what happened inside that house. What you may not understand yet, what most people struggle to understand when they hear stories like this, is how it continued. How a person can be harmed over and over again across hundreds of days and no one knows. How a young woman with access to a phone and a campus and a world outside those front doors can feel as trapped as if she were behind iron bars. The answer is not weakness. The answer is not stupidity. The answer is control. Systematic, deliberate, psychologically sophisticated control that Daryl and Aaron exercised over every part of Melinda's world. Daryl controlled the narrative. He was the one who spoke to Diane on the phone when Diane called to check in. He would hand the phone to Melinda only after a short, quiet look that she learned to read quickly. A look that said, "Be careful what you say." He would sit in the same room during those calls, not always close, but close enough. And Melinda would sit there talking to her mother about nothing, about her classes, about the weather, about nothing, while everything that mattered was locked behind her teeth. He told her that if she said anything, Diane would have a breakdown. He said her mother's health couldn't handle it. He knew Diane had been dealing with high blood pressure. He used that. He weaponized a daughter's love for her mother and turned it into a reason to stay silent. "You want to kill your mother?" he said to her once, his voice low and even, in the hallway outside her bedroom door, because that's what this would do to her. Aaron's methods were crueler in a more direct way. He made sure she understood what would happen to her if she spoke. He reminded her that she had no money of her own. He reminded her that her scholarship required a home address and that her home address was this house. He told her she would lose her place at the university. He told her she would have to go back to her mother with nothing. He told her that no one would believe her anyway, because who was going to believe a girl against two grown men with clean records and a good standing in the community? "No one will believe you," he said. He said it so often it became a kind of background noise in her life. It became the weather. She stopped thinking of it as a threat and started thinking of it as a fact. That is what prolonged emotional abuse does to a person. It doesn't just hurt them, it rewires the way they see reality. She started performing normalcy with frightening precision. She smiled in her classes. She turned in her assignments. She nodded along in conversations. She laughed at the right times. She had become an expert at existing in a way that showed nothing, because showing something, showing pain, showing fear, showing anything real had become dangerous inside that house. And when you spend enough time hiding in plain sight, you start to forget that you are hiding at all. There were days when she sat in a lecture hall surrounded by hundreds of people and felt as though she was the only person on the planet. There were days when she walked across campus in the September sunshine and felt nothing. Not warmth, not hope, just the mechanical act of putting one foot in front of the other and making it through the day without falling apart. People often wonder why victims in these situations don't simply call the police. And I want to take a moment to answer that question honestly, because it's the wrong question asked by people who have never been inside a trap that was built specifically around them. The question isn't why she didn't call. The question is exactly what was she supposed to say? To whom? With what proof? Standing in what position of safety? With what resources? With what certainty that anyone would take her side over theirs? The system that should have caught this was not watching. The people who should have noticed were not looking. And Melinda was doing what every person in an impossible situation does. She was surviving, one impossible day at a time. I want to ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it. If you were in Melinda's position, 18 years old, no money, dependent on the very people hurting you, afraid of what the truth would cost your mother, what would you have done? Be honest with yourself, because most of us, if we are being truly honest, don't actually know. Tell us in the comments. These conversations matter. There is a question that gets asked about every victim of sustained abuse. It comes from a place of discomfort rather than cruelty, usually, from people who are trying to make sense of something that refuses to make easy sense. The question is, why didn't she just leave? And I want to take this section of the story to answer that question properly. Not to defend Melinda, because Melinda does not need defending, but to give you the full picture, because without the full picture, this story is just pain without meaning, and Melinda's story deserves more than that. The first reason she didn't leave is money. Melinda had none of her own. Her scholarship covered tuition. Daryl and Aaron covered everything else. The roof, the food, the electricity she needed for her coursework. She had no savings, no credit card, no financial cushion of any kind. Leaving would have meant leaving with nothing. And when you have nothing, nowhere to go is a very concrete reality, not a metaphor. The second reason is isolation. By the time the abuse was a regular, established part of her life, Melinda had no close friends on campus. She had acquaintances, people who would wave in the hallway, nobody she trusted enough to walk up to and say, "I need help." The isolation that Daryl had engineered so carefully in those first months had done its job. She was surrounded by people and completely, utterly alone. The third reason is shame. This is the one people least want to talk about, but it is real, and it is powerful, and it deserves to be said out loud. Melinda was ashamed, not of anything she had done. She had done nothing wrong, but shame does not require guilt to exist. Shame is what happens when something deeply violating is done to you, and the world has taught you, consciously and unconsciously, that you are somehow responsible for what people do to your body. She had been raised in a community where these things were not spoken about, where family was everything, where surviving in silence was considered a kind of strength. She had absorbed those lessons, and they were being used against her. The fourth reason is fear. Raw, physical, bone-deep fear. Not just fear of Daryl and Aaron, though that fear was real and warranted, but fear of what the truth would set in motion. Fear of her mother's reaction. Fear of being disbelieved. Fear of losing her place at the university. Fear of becoming the girl who destroyed the family. She had watched Aaron's 17 calls. She had read his messages. She knew what these men were capable of when they felt threatened, and she had no guarantee that anyone outside those walls would protect her from that. And then there is the fifth reason, which is the hardest to explain to someone who has never experienced sustained abuse: trauma bonding. There were moments, not many, but they existed, when Daryl was kind to her, when Aaron was quiet and left her alone for a stretch of days, and the house felt almost normal. These moments were not signs that things were okay. They were part of the cycle. They were the mechanism by which an abuser keeps a person trapped, by reminding them of the gentler version of themselves, by creating just enough relief to reset the clock before the cycle begins again. The brain, under sustained stress and fear, begins to attach to these moments of relief with desperate gratitude. It is not weakness, it is neuroscience. It is what happens to human beings under conditions of prolonged captivity. She didn't leave because leaving felt impossible, not unlikely, not difficult, impossible. And until you have been in a situation where every single exit has been quietly, systematically sealed, financially, socially, emotionally, physically, you cannot fully understand what impossible feels like from the inside. But something changed. Something always changes. It has to. Because people like Melinda, people who are still fighting even when they can barely remember what they are fighting for, eventually find a crack in the wall. And when they do, they move through it. It was in the winter of her second year, 14 months into the abuse, that Melinda started a journal. Not a diary with a lock and a key, just a plain black notebook that she bought from the campus bookstore and kept at the bottom of her backpack, under her textbooks, because her backpack was the one place in that house that felt entirely and only hers. She didn't write dates. She didn't write long entries. She wrote small, precise sentences, like a person cataloging evidence, because some part of her, some survival-driven, quietly defiant part of her, had decided that what was happening to her would eventually need to be proven. She was right about that.
The breaking point came 6 months later, on a night in early spring when Aaron escalated beyond anything that had happened before. She didn't document it in detail, and we will not recount it in detail, but what she wrote that night was this: "I am not going to survive this house. I have to get out. I have to tell someone." She had written that before. She had thought it before, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't a feeling, it was a decision. The next day, she went to campus and sat outside the student counselor's office for 45 minutes without going in. She got up and left. She came back the following morning and sat there again. And on that second day, a graduate student who worked as a peer support volunteer, a young woman named Keisha, with box braids and paint-stained fingers, and a voice that was unhurried in a way that felt rare, came and sat next to her and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "You don't have to talk, but if you want to, I'm not going anywhere." Melinda talked for 3 hours. Keisha did not panic. She did not express horror. She did not say any of the things that would have sent Melinda running back behind her wall. She listened. She asked careful questions. She said, "You are not responsible for what happened to you." She said it simply, plainly, like a fact. And something in Melinda's chest shifted in a way she would later describe as feeling like a window being cracked open in a room that had been sealed for too long. Keisha walked her to the campus Title IX office that same afternoon, and the next morning, the morning Sister Patricia came by with the casserole. Melinda was already ready. She had been ready since she sat in that hallway and let herself be heard for the first time in 14 months. When Daryl came home that evening and found her room cleared out, he called her phone 4 times. She didn't answer. He drove to Sister Patricia's house. He knew the address and knocked on the door. Sister Patricia opened it, looked at him, and said, "She's not here, and you need to leave now." She closed the door in his face. She told Melinda later that her hands were shaking when she did it, that it was one of the hardest things she had ever done, but she did it. Aaron, in those same hours, was sending messages, threatening, pleading, then threatening again. By midnight, he had sent 43 text messages to Melinda's phone. Each one was logged. Each one was forwarded. Each one became part of what came next. The formal police report was filed 72 hours after Melinda left the house. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Detective Carol Haynes, a 12-year veteran of the crimes unit with a reputation for working sexual assault cases with both thoroughness and dignity. She met with Melinda in a quiet room with no recording equipment visible on the table, because she knew, as anyone who has worked these cases long enough knows, that the environment matters, that a person who has spent 2 years learning to be silent needs to feel safe before they can speak. Melinda spoke. She spoke for 3 hours. Not continuously, but in sessions, measured, methodical sessions, where Detective Haynes asked questions and Melinda answered, and sometimes cried, and sometimes didn't, and sometimes had to stop and breathe and come back. Melinda also produced the journal, every small, precise entry, every date-free, detail-specific sentence. It was, Detective Haynes said later in court documents, some of the most compelling contemporaneous documentation she had encountered in a decade of this work. The text messages from Aaron, all 43 of them, were subpoenaed and forensically examined. Several of them contained implicit and explicit admissions. Aaron had written things in those panicked midnight hours that his own defense attorney would later call catastrophic. When a man believes he is losing control, he sometimes loses it entirely. Aaron lost it entirely that night in front of his own phone screen. Daryl was interviewed 3 days after the report was filed. He came in with a lawyer. He was composed. He spoke in measured sentences. He expressed concern for Melinda's mental health. He suggested, with careful phrasing, that she had been struggling academically and emotionally for some time and had perhaps developed a distorted relationship with reality. His lawyer was good, but Detective Haynes was better, and the evidence had already told its story before Daryl ever sat down in that room. The church community fractured almost immediately. There were people, a significant number of people, who simply refused to believe it, who came forward to speak about Daryl's character, who wrote letters describing Aaron as a man of quiet integrity. Some of these people were not malicious. Some of them were genuinely unable to reconcile what they were hearing with the men they thought they knew. But their disbelief had a cost, and that cost was paid entirely by Melinda. She was called a liar by people who had watched her grow up. She was described as troubled, as attention-seeking, as a girl who had always been difficult. A cousin posted on social media that the family stood behind Daryl and Aaron 100%. The post got 47 likes from people Melinda had known her whole life. She saw it. She read every single one of those names, and she had to find a way to keep standing anyway. Both Daryl and Aaron were formally charged. The charges included sexual abuse and multiple counts related to the sustained nature and severity of what they had done. The case moved slowly through the court system. These cases always do. Delays, continuances, procedural motions, each one another small wound in the long process of getting to the truth. Melinda attended every hearing. She sat in those hard courtroom chairs, and she listened to lawyers argue about her life in careful legal language, and she did not fall apart. She had made a decision to not fall apart. She had decided that if the only thing she could control was whether or not she showed up, she was going to show up every single time. Daryl eventually pled guilty to a reduced charge, sparing Melinda the trauma of a full trial, under a plea arrangement that still resulted in a significant prison sentence. Aaron went to trial. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They came back with a guilty verdict on all counts. When the verdict was read, Melinda sat very still for a moment, and then she exhaled, a long, slow, shaking exhale that she had been holding for 2 years.
How do you feel knowing that there were people, family members, who chose to publicly defend the men who hurt her? Does that surprise you? Has something similar ever happened in your own family, where the wrong person was protected and the right person was left to stand alone? We want to hear from you in the comments. Melinda did not go back to her mother's city. She finished her degree. It took her an extra 1.5 years because trauma does that. It stretches time and steals it, but she finished. She was in the 3rd row at graduation. Her mother, Diane, was in the audience, crying behind her sunglasses, wearing a dress she had bought specifically for that day. It was purple, Melinda's favorite color. She started therapy 6 weeks after leaving the house. Her therapist was a black woman in her 50s who specialized in trauma and abuse recovery, and their weekly sessions became the scaffolding that held Melinda together while she rebuilt herself from the inside out. It was not a clean process. Healing never is. There were weeks when she barely left her apartment. There were weeks when she was angry in a way that had no object, a hot, diffuse rage at the world for being the kind of place where this could happen. There were nights when she woke at 3 in the morning and sat at the window and stayed there until the sky changed color. She moved to a different state after graduation, somewhere no one knew her name, somewhere she could walk down the street without feeling someone else's version of her story trailing behind her. She got an apartment with a small patio. She planted things, herbs mostly, basil and mint, and small stubborn rosemary bushes that smelled sharp and clean when she brushed her fingers against them in the morning. She said once to Kezia, who had become one of her closest friends, that the smell of rosemary felt like the opposite of that house. She couldn't explain it any further than that. She didn't need to. She still carried what happened to her. She would carry it for the rest of her life. There is no version of this story where that isn't true. But she had made a decision
The same quiet, defiant decision she had made when she started that journal, that what she carried would not be the only thing she was. She had survived something that was designed to destroy her, and instead of being destroyed, she had decided to become a nurse, to work with survivors of domestic abuse and sexual trauma, to be for someone else what Sister Patricia had been for her, to stand in a doorway and look at a girl who is holding something unbearable and say, "Baby, what's wrong?" and to mean it with everything she had. She is doing that now, every day, in a hospital whose name she has asked not to be shared, in a city where she has built a quiet, decent, purposeful life. Melinda is doing exactly what she always said she would do. She is taking care of people. She is needed. She is capable. She is exactly who she always intended to be. She trusted them. They were family. That was the danger. We talk about strangers. We teach our children about strangers. We build our fear around the unknown face, the unfamiliar name, the dark street, and the person you have never seen before. But Melinda's story, and the stories of so many people like her, tells us something we are not always willing to say out loud. The danger is not always outside the door. Sometimes the danger holds your door open for you. Sometimes it knows your name. Sometimes it shares your last name. Sometimes it sits at the same table and passes the salt and asks how your classes are going. 2 years of Melinda's life were taken inside a house that was supposed to be home. 2 years of a young woman who wanted nothing more than to study hard, become a nurse, and take care of people. 2 years of her life handed over to men who were trusted by everyone and accountable to no one. That is not a small thing. That is not something to get through quickly. That is the kind of wound that changes the shape of a person from the inside. But Melinda is still here, and she is still fighting, not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily, every single day. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse in any form, from a family member, a partner, anyone, please reach out to the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4637. It is free, it is confidential, it is available 24 hours a day. You do not have to stay silent. You do not have to survive alone. Tell someone, tell anyone, tell and tell until you find the person who believes you, because that person exists. Melinda found hers, and so can you. Abuse doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it shares your last name.
I think we're going to stop here, right? Because this video is over 30 minutes already, and we want to make our videos 30. Anyways, stay tuned, subscribe, share this video, drop a comment, right? Let's create this awareness together. Do this.